So
we heard there's whiskey.
that only comes if you like my presentation.
And you got a wristband. You gotta have a wristband.
Yeah, wristband.
All
right.
So English.
When I signed up to come here, they asked me if I would do this presentation. I said I'd love to. They said, well, what's the time frame? I said, well, it's about 300 years. They said, can you condense that into 45 minutes? So here it comes. All right, we're going to talk about when a lot of people think of Scotland, particularly those people who are not really involved, knowledgeable in the Scottish subculture, whatever, think about Scotland. The only thing that ever comes to mind is Rob Roy, what's the midget's name? Mel Gibson. You know, that type of thing. They think about the Highlands, like all of Scotland is comprised of the Highlands. But it's not true. There's other parts of Scotland, and there's actually guys from Scotland here who can attest to that. They will tell you that there's other parts. The part that I'd like to talk about tonight are the Anglo-Scottish borders, particularly a group of people called the Border Reivers. And the story of the Border Reivers took place between 1296 and 1603. It's kind of a crazy time to be living on the Scottish borders. And this is my official. Can you hear that? All right. So we're going to talk about who the Border Reivers were, where they came from, how they developed. Talk about a couple of Reiver legends, and then what happened to the Reivers. If you think the Highland clearances was bad, about 100 years before that, this will break your heart. So how do you identify a Border Reiver? All right, they were very militarily centered, because at that time, that area, there was nothing but constant fighting. You're on the border between Scotland and England. King Edward is the king. Stuff's going on. There's people going back and forth. There's battles going on left and right. So basically, your backyard is a battlefield. So you yourself are a soldier. So your basic border cricketer, this is your average Joe. You know, his main weapon is a lance. He's got a target for a shield. A jack-o'-plate was a vest that was made with plates of metal sewn into it. They couldn't afford armor or mail. That was the best that they could do. Worked out pretty good, gave them a lot of agility and freedom of movement. High boots, riding boots. The Scots, and we'll talk about this in a minute, the Reivers, had a little horse called a Galway pony. Sometimes some called it a hobby. It was a small pony. Very agile in the hills that surrounded the border, the Cheviot Hills. And at night, when most of the raiding took place, very sure-footed horse. You really wouldn't want to be on an Arabian stallion at a time like that. Your more noble, the people with money, the leaders of the clans, they could actually afford a breastplate and a backplate. They could afford a helmet. Sometimes it was a Morian, sometimes it was a Bergenet, French or Spanish. Typically had a visor and a comb on the top. You know, they kind of look. Everybody looks at those and say, "What did I do that for?" Well, that's a great way to deflect a sword blow to the head, because a lot of people died from sword blows. So that's basically, again, the high riding boots. They were very thick. As they're riding into combat, you know, you're doing your sword thing. Kind of hard to cut through that thick of leather. So move on. This is kind of this is an artist's rendering. The hobby was a small horse. It wasn't a very large horse, so it almost looks kind of silly, this big man riding on a horse like that. But again, that horse could ride all day and all night long. Very sure-footed in the marshes and in the moors, and typically up the hills. All right. Who were the Border Reivers? All right, so this is basically the Scottish borders. This defined north and south, Scotland and England. A lot of these families came from, well, my family, Bell, came from, initially came from Normandy during the Norman conquest of 1066. Because the family fought for William the Conqueror, they were given lands. A lot of the families came from that way. Some of these families came from Norwegian descent, the Vikings. Some came from the Irish descent, the Gaelic-speaking people. There were Saxons, there were Anglos, kind of a melting pot there. And in the early days, there wasn't a lot of animosity between, the borders. You did have some families that were on both sides of the border. The Bells, we sort of played both ends. Armstrongs and a few others. Large families, a lot of intermarrying between families. The location, the border runs from Solway Firth in the west, all the way up through the Cheviot Hills, north of Berwick upon Tweed. Berwick originally was Scotland, but it ended up in England. Now it's all the same, so it doesn't really matter. And the landscape, you've got marshes, peat bogs, you've got rocky outcrops. It changes quite a bit. In fact, I was telling the lovely Dr. Saxon here, initially England and Scotland were two different land masses that came together about 450 million years ago. But if you look at the geological makeup of both, on the Scottish side, you've got a lot of rock, granite, things like that. On the English side, it's coal and softer geological composition. So it was a huge difference. But during that, as they came together, basically pushed up and formed the Cheviot Hills, which about 94 miles takes up all this area right here. They're not very tall, but pretty awesome to look at. We'll show a picture later, like right now. There they are. Very, very, very beautiful and very formidable as far as passing through. It gets very cold up there in the winter times, and during the period of the 15th and 16th century, that was sort of the prelude to the Little Ice Age that came a little later, when things were getting hard, which added to what was about to happen. All right. Now, much like the Highland clans, the Border Reivers were very family-centric. They weren't really particularly devoted to England or Scotland. They were basically devoted to family, and families oftentimes had alliances with other families. Bell was a smaller family. We had alliances with the Douglases and with the Armstrongs. There was a lot of intermarrying going on, and that sort of, a smaller house had protected them. And like the Highland clans, there was typically a chief that sort of was over all within the. Oh, you're getting ahead of me. Sorry. No, I should anticipate. You should anticipate. Go forward. All right. So in 1249, they decided to break up. Things are starting to get a little messy down there. They decided to break up the borders into marches, 3 marches per side, east, west, and middle. And that was basically the districts. They were assigned wardens. Each warden basically was a governor, if you will. They sort of oversaw things having to do with political, law, things like that. On the English side, they were typically noblemen that came up from southern England. A lot of them didn't particularly care for the weather up there, but they thought it was an opportunity to advance within the political or nobility rankings, make some money. And on the Scottish side, it was typically the larger houses, the major families, Maxwells, Carrs, Armstrongs. These are the major Reaver families, and they oftentimes, their clan chiefs or headsmen were the wardens of that area. So, how do they develop? All right, so prior to the 14th century, things were kind of, easy going. Both sides got along. There wasn't a lot of conflict. There was intermarrying. You had sheep, a lot of sheep farming going on and wool production. The town of Berwick was a port city, so there was a lot of shipping and trade going on. The land itself was fairly prosperous as far as agriculture. People lived on both sides of the borders, moved back and forth, intermarried between the two, and in fact, some of the more wealthy families owned land on both sides. So, But then, always something's going to happen. So in 1286, Alexander III, who was the King of Scotland, his first wife, Margaret, he had several children with her. They all died. His oldest daughter, Margaret, had a daughter named Margaret, and she was married off to the King of Norway, Eric II. They had a daughter. They named her Margaret. So there's a theme going here if you have to pick Margaret. Okay. Just want to make sure you're with me. I know it's cool in here. So, next one. Have I? Okay. So, no, you were right. You were right the first time. I'm going too fast. But Margaret died. Margaret, the first Margaret, wife. Alexander married had a new wife, Yolanda. She was French. And he was in Edinburgh for a council and really wanted to get home to be with his new wife. The weather was bad. He had to travel north along the coast. It was raining. He was advised not to go, and in his travels that night, was thrown from his horse, dropped approximately 300 feet off the side of a cliff, did not survive. So, what are we going to do? His only legitimate heir is Margaret, who is his granddaughter. She was called the Maid of Norway, and the nobles really didn't want to bring in the Maid of Norway. So of course there were nobles that were going to step up. You know, John Balliol being one, Robert Bruce. This would be the grandfather of King Robert Bruce. Perfectly willing to take the job of king, but they sort of were battling back and forth with the families. Sort of appealed to King Edward of England. Edward was like, "Hey, look, I'll even give you my son. He'll marry Margaret." And they're thinking, "Oh, you know, no, we don't really want another English." You know, the ramifications of Edward's son being married to the Queen of Scotland wasn't their greatest idea. So they agreed to allow Margaret, the Maiden of Norway, to be the queen. So in her travels over, unfortunately, she dies. So now we're back to John Balliol and Robert Bruce. Edward had some input in that, but eventually John Balliol was crowned the king. John was sort of a weak man and was very easily manipulated by Edward. After about 3 years, the Scottish nobles had enough of that. Basically, there was a council, created the Council of 12. They basically pushed John out and kind of left Edward hanging in the wind. He didn't like that, so he decided to do what kings do, and he invaded Scotland. Thus begins the Wars of Independence. So, that was a lot to cover. So, talking about the Reivers themselves, again, like cavalry, they were expert horsemen. Oftentimes, they were conscripts to other armies. They fought with the Netherlands in the wars against Spain, and oftentimes, as history progressed, for England in different conflicts. This is sort of an array of the armor and weaponry that they carried and had. The Bergeron, or the Warrior helmets, very common. Basket hilt back swords, the long 8-foot pike, latch crossbows. This is a jack of pike, which was basically a vest with metal steel plates sewn into it. Very economical piece of armor. Later on, you saw the wheel-lock pistol, the dag, and then, of course, the iconic basket hilt back sword. Again, the helmets. These were referred to as steel bonnets. Very common term for the helmets that the Border Reivers wore. Again, another look at the jack plate. The sword is just there. All right, one of the most famous Reivers was Kinloch Willie Armstrong from Clan Armstrong. Very, very prolific Reiver. The English weren't too thrilled with him. He would actually command a group of 3,000 Reivers. They would go into England. They would come back with hundreds of head of cattle and sheep and whatever else they could steal. But on this particular day in 1596, they would have these days of truce where English and Scottish would get together because, again, there were families on both sides of the border. And the wardens would also get together for the particular march. They'd work out whatever happens, whatever issues there were between the two because they were the law keepers. And on this day, it was sort of a day of amnesty. So if you were wanted by the law, they would not arrest you. But on this particular day, Kinmont was a particularly wanted criminal, and the English took the opportunity to seize him and take him to prison. They put him in the dungeon in Carlisle Castle. Well, the Scots, of course, were very upset with that, and William Scott, who was the bold, sorry, all this history. I'm trying to get through 300 years. Anyway, he pitched a fit, reached out to the Crown. They would not allow Kinmont Willie to be released, so he basically formed a raiding party. They went into Carlisle and they basically rescued Kinmont Willie, which started a huge row between James, King of Scotland, and Elizabeth, Queen of England. She actually demanded that Walter Scott appear before her, and when he eventually did, he actually turned the pants off of himself. One for the Scottish side, right? Another great Reiver, Hobby Noble, was actually an Englishman, was convicted of crimes in England, went over into Scotland, was eventually captured there. In fact, they say that the ballad says that he was dreaming that he was being set upon when he woke up. It was true. He was captured, taken back. They pressed him and tortured him, trying to get him to reveal the location of other Reivers. He said he would rather be a prisoner than a traitor, and that was sort of the mentality of border Reivers at that time. They were very loyal to their kind, would never give them up. Not particularly loyal to either crown, but to the family. So, the Scottish Mafia. So for this 300-year period, when reaving or robbing was the way of life along the borders, there was cattle rustling, sheep stealing. They had instituted protection rackets. The word blackmail actually came from this period of time, from the Scottish borders. Mail was the rent that you paid on land, and blackmail referred to being paid for protection or extortion, that sort of thing. Being caught red-handed was another common term at the time. If you were a murderer, you were caught red-handed, you had the blood of your victim's hand. And that was basically saying there's no refuting it. You were caught red-handed. You had the blood on your hands. And these words have entered our lexicon now. All right, so the end of the borders. How am I doing on time? 3:15. All right, I can do this. I'm sweating. All right, so Queen Elizabeth died, no heirs. She'd been sick for a long time. Everybody sort of knew it was coming. The closest heir that she had, or relative that she had, was actually James Stuart, who was James VI of Scotland. And through communication between her trusted advisor, her chief of staff, and James, it was basically a lock-in that when she died, he was going to take over. So he's just sitting by waiting for this. Okay. All right. When she died, the Reivers went crazy because James was not a friend of the Reivers. The Reivers understood that when he came into power, that things were going to change. So the week afterward, they call it Ill Week or Busy Week, the Reivers just absolutely went crazy, going into England, the Scottish Reivers into England, English Reivers into Scotland, because both sides were going to meet the same fate. but they were basically cashing in on as much as they could. During that week, they estimated about 4,000 heads of cattle, 5,000 sheep and goats were stolen, not to mention all the ancillary goodies that were picked up along the way. So again, through this secret correspondence from Sir Robert Cecil, the chief's, basically chief minister or chief of staff, James knew that he was going to become king of England. So the news travels, and James is slowly on his way down. Basically, he timed it so that by the time he got there, the funeral would have been over, and the focus would have been on him. It was sort of a triumphant ride everywhere he went, and you know, word was out that he was going to assume the crown, and wherever he went, it was sort of like when a rock star comes in. I mean, people were hailing him and cheering him on, and probably did a lot for his ego. All right, so James, obviously not fond of the border reivers. Pretty much one of his first focuses is to fix the borders. All right, we've got to stop everything that's been going on. For 300 years, the borders were not loyal to the crown, they were loyal to themselves. He needs to get stabilization in that region. All right? So the first thing that happens is the Border Commission is set up in Carlisle. We've got 5 English lords, 5 Scottish lords, and together they're basically going to put together the plan for cleaning house. George Home, somebody came by my tent today and we were talking about the homes. And he basically headed up the Border Commission. They basically went down and wrote down all the major clans, picking up, you know, you're talking about Armstrongs, Elliots, Maxwells, Grahams. These are the big names in there, and these are the ones they went after. And they imposed something that was referred to as jet out justice. If you know what a summary execution is, basically they were hanged first and asked questions later. So without really having a trial, these people were hanged. They were hanged from trees, they were hanged from gallows, it didn't matter. So again, Grahams, Elliots, Armstrongs. Also, one of the things I didn't talk about with the Reivers were basically their homes. Their homes were basically small fortified castles. They call them peel towers. They were set up so that if there was ever a siege or there was ever an invasion, they could bring their cattle in, which they would keep on the first floor. Then there would be subsequent floors, 2, 3 floors, where the family could live, where things could happen. And then at the top floor, they could actually defend the castle. But these were being destroyed. Approximately 40 of them were destroyed during this period. All right. At that point, what are you going to do with them? You know, they've kind of broken them. What are they going to do with these people? A lot of them were forced into conscription. They fought again against Spain and the Netherlands, and in different battles. They were sent to the Ulster plantation in Northern Ireland. If you've ever heard the term Scots-Irish or Scotch-Irish, these were the Scots initially from the border region, and then subsequently from the Highlands, that were sent over basically because England had a problem with Ireland too. So we figured the best way to handle the Irish is let's just send the Scots over there, and you know, one thing or another, somebody's going to take care of somebody. And either way, it benefited the English. Those that didn't go to Northern Ireland may have gone on to the colonies. And then there were a few that kind of hung out. They weren't particularly associated with any particular houses. They were referred to as moss troopers, and these were highwaymen who continued to live the border life, but they were true outlaws. Not doing it because that was the only way to make a living, living in that area, but because they were indeed thieves. All right. So the borders have become pacified. The Reivers have been crushed. They took away the Galway pony. They took away their weapons. They were no longer allowed to own weapons. The only horses they were allowed to have were plow horses. Much like, again, when you refer to the Highland clearances, the wearing of the tartan and the weapons that they had, these were illegal. I'm beyond that. All right, so in 10 years, James was able to stabilize the borders. The part you wrote that part. All right, so again, Galway ponies were outlawed, weapons were outlawed, land and homes were seized, lands were given to English lords and Scottish lords that were useful in helping in putting down the Reivers. There really was no way to make a living anymore, and so there was the forced relocation to Northern Ireland and the colonies, and a lot of people were deported to, and a lot of this came even later. They went to the continent, and they also ended up in Australia. So when we think about Reivers in history, we're all probably more familiar with this stuff being here in the southern United States, but the Appalachian Mountains, we think about the Appalachians and who pioneered those Appalachians. It was the Scots and Scots-Irish. You look at everything from moonshine stills to just being recluse and living up there in the mountains, and we've all seen Outland. So the fur trade, because the Scots were sort of a wild and crazy bunch, the Indians had a lot of respect for them. They had there was a kinship there, and the Scots had no problem with the Indians' beliefs or how they lived, their way of life, and they adapted very easily into that. And they actually dominated the fur trade here in the southeastern United States for quite some time. And then, of course, the first man on the moon, Neil Armstrong. The Armstrongs were the premier border reaver family for those 300 years. And it's always nice, when you have a kid do good. So anyway, that's what I got. Basically, it's very, very high level. There was a whole thing going on the borders for 300 years. The Highlanders aren't the only cool ones in Scotland. So I hope that opens some eyes here. If you're descendant of a border reaver clan, you want to know more information, we do have a tent over here, the Bell Clan tent. Would love you to stop by. We're here till 5. Thank you.